In his inaugural remarks in January 1937, in the midst of the Great Depression, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked out at the nation, and this is what he saw. He saw tens of millions of its citizens denied the basic necessities of life. He saw millions of families trying to live on incomes so meager that the pall of family disaster hung over them day by day. He saw millions denied education, recreation, and the opportunity to better their lot and the lot of their children. He saw millions lacking the means to buy the products they needed, and by their poverty and lack of disposable income denying employment to many other millions. He saw 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, and he acted against the ferocious opposition of the ruling class of his day, people he called economic royalists. Roosevelt implemented a series of programs that put millions of people back to work, took them out of poverty, and restored their faith in government. He redefined the relationship of the federal government to the people of our country. He combated cynicism, fear, and despair. He reinvigorated democracy. He transformed the country, and that is what we have to do today. And, by the way, almost everything he proposed was called socialist. Social Security, which transformed life for the elderly in this country, was socialist. The concept of the minimum wage was seen as a radical intrusion into the marketplace and was described as socialist. Unemployment insurance, abolishing child labor, the 40-hour work week, collective bargaining, strong banking regulations, deposit insurance, and job programs that put millions of people to work were all described, in one way or another, as socialist. Yet, these programs have become the fabric of our nation and the foundation of the middle class. 30 years later, in the 1960s, President Johnson passed Medicare and Medicaid to provide health care to millions of senior citizens and families with children, persons with disabilities, and some of the most vulnerable people in this county. Once again, these vitally important programs were derided by the right wing as socialist programs that were a threat to our American way of life. That was then. Now is now. Today, despite the Wall Street crash of 2008, which drove this country into the worst economic downturn since the Depression, the American people are clearly better off economically than we were in 1937. But, here is a very hard truth that we must acknowledge and address. Despite a huge increase in technology and productivity, despite major growth in the U.S. and global economy, tens of millions of American families continue to lack the basic necessities of life, while millions more struggle every day to provide a minimal standard of living for their families. The reality is that for the last 40 years the great middle class of this country has been in decline, and faith in our political system is now extremely low. The rich get much richer, almost everyone else gets poorer. Super PACs funded by billionaires buy elections. Ordinary people don't vote. We have an economic and political crisis in this country, and the same old establishment politics and economics will not effectively address it. If we are serious about transforming our country, if we are serious about rebuilding the middle class, if we are serious about reinvigorating our democracy, we need to develop a political movement which, once again, is prepared to take on and defeat your anger ruling class whose greed is destroying our nation. The billionaire class cannot have it all. Our government belongs to all of us, and not just the 1%. We need to create a culture which, as Pope Francis reminds us, cannot just be based on the worship of money. We must not accept a nation in which billionaires compete as to the size of their super yachts, while children in America go hungry and veterans sleep out on the streets. Today, in America, we are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, but few Americans know that because so much of the new income and wealth goes to the people on top. In fact, over the last 30 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth, trillions of wealth, going from the middle class to the top 1/10 of 1%, a handful of people who have seen a doubling of the percentage of the wealth they own over that period. Unbelievably, and grotesquely, the top 1/10 of 1% owns nearly as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Today, in America, millions of our people are working 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. In fact, Americans work longer hours than do the people of any industrialized country. Despite the incredibly hard work and long hours of the American middle class, 58% of all new income generated today is going to the top 1%. Today, in America, as the middle class continues to disappear, median family income is $4,100 less than it was in 1999. The median male worker made over $700 less than he did 42 years ago, after adjusting for inflation. Last year, The median female worker earned more than $1,000 less than she did in 2007. Today, in America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, more than half of older workers have no retirement savings, zero, while millions of elderly and people with disabilities are trying to survive on $12,000 or $13,000 a year. From Vermont to California, older workers are scared to death. How will I retire with dignity? They ask. Today, in America, nearly 47 million Americans are living in poverty, and over 20% of our children, including 36% of African American children, are living in poverty, the highest rate of childhood poverty of nearly any major country on earth. Today, in America, 29 million Americans have no health insurance, and even more are underinsured with outrageously high co-payments and deductibles. Further, with the United States paying the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, 1 out of 5 patients cannot afford to fill the prescriptions their doctors write. Today, in America, youth unemployment and underemployment is over 35%. Meanwhile, we have more people in jail than any other country, and countless lives are being destroyed as we spend $80 billion a year locking up fellow Americans. The bottom line is that today in America we not only have massive wealth and income inequality, but a power structure which protects that inequality. A handful of super wealthy campaign contributors have enormous influence over the political process, while their lobbyists determine much of what goes on in Congress. In 1944, in his State of the Union speech, President Roosevelt outlined what he called a Second Bill of Rights. This is one of the most important speeches ever made by a president, but, unfortunately, it has not gotten the attention that it deserves. In that speech, Roosevelt described the economic rights that he believed every American was entitled to: the right to a decent job at decent pay, the right to adequate food, clothing, and time off from work, the right for every business, large and small, to function in an atmosphere free from unfair competition and domination by monopolies, the right of all Americans to have a decent home and decent health care. What Roosevelt was stating in 1944, what Martin Luther King, Jr. stated in similar terms 20 years later, and what I believe today, is that true freedom does not occur without economic security. People are not truly free when they are unable to feed their family. People are not truly free when they are unable to retire with dignity. People are not truly free when they are unemployed or underpaid, or when they are exhausted by working long hours. People are not truly free when they have no health care.